So today we're going to cover in an hour a very complex subject with hopefully a little bit of fun. We're not going to cover in detail every aspect of a good AEM program, but we're going to highlight some of the things that you should consider. This will be a interactive session. There'll be a couple of polls. So the first thing I'd point out is if you could scan that QR code if you want to use your smartphone. If not, and if it doesn't work as well as we think it will, we'll just raise hands on a couple of questions. Yes, no questions, some other questions. But when I say interactive too, please, raise your hand, blurt out at an appropriate point a question. I'm not that formal that you need to raise your hand, but if I don't catch that you're interested in kind of delving into something, please do. A little bit of background about me. I've been in the field for about 30 plus years. I recently joined ECRI. I've had a lot of different exposures and roles, primarily in healthcare systems, primarily supporting directly as an in-house person, but I've also been on the multi-vendor side. That's why I picked on, if you were in the meeting, I picked on one of my former companies years and years ago. I didn't know who the folks were in the last presentation. That's a little bit about me, but one other thing that might help you understand a little bit about where my passions are. I want to make sure that as we all grow up together, right? So if you have some ideas, as we all grow up together, we should collaborate. And this actually came up in the actual hall a little bit. It's, for example, making sure that we collaborate together and aren't all mavericks. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. On AEM, though, we'll talk a little bit about how you can reinvent the wheel and how you might want to collaborate. And okay, I don't know which, that's the pointer in the wrong direction. I thought I was in Australia for a second there. Anyway, I said we're going to try and have a little bit of fun with this on a kind of a boring topic sometimes, and that's on alternate equipment management. Yes, I'm playing around with trying to create an actual game from this, but all these images are static. With one that I posted as a GIF out, or a GIF, or whatever you call it, out on the internet. Again, polling app. Okay, so we were going to kind of assess where you all are, right, on understanding or where you are in your strategy around AEM. And when we refer to AEM today, it will primarily be the term alternate or alternative equipment maintenance, right? Now there is a management level, but we're going to talk about the practice of maintaining equipment. Management can take on some other aspects. So, do you have a formal AEM policy? And have you got documented justification for those things that you have elected or decided? Again, hopefully we'll get into this through a risk-based approach to justify. I got to that already. Risk assessment. Are you using some sort of risk-based tool? This is another area where we seem to have reinvented the wheel or morphed the wheel or whatever. There's no exact standard, but some use the Fenico model. Some use some other models to do risk assessment. But when I talk about risk assessment in this case, and I believe that that CMS, Joint Commission, and other AOs, when they're talking about risk, they're talking primarily about risk to the patient. I think they are really, I say primarily because we can expand that to talk about mission critical risk to an organization, right? And CMS certainly kind of applies that. We'll get into that. And then are you continuously improving on your AEM process? Just because you've elected to put something on an AEM doesn't mean it always stays on an AEM. We'll get into that. Now, again, if these don't update, we will flip over to mentimeter.com. My attempt to try to do this. Present it. Now, I said we were going to assess. So if you, those of you that are in the app, or if you didn't get in the app and you want to join us on this menti.com website with that code, please respond and you'll see in real time kind of who has which of these 4 elements or all 4 elements kind of underway. Okay, we'll close it there. We have, oh, whoa, okay, even better, I guess. So the sample size looks about the same, except for there's somebody out here that says, hey, it's not really part of my organization. And that's why I put it in there, because we may have people that are in marketing or sales, or they're a vendor partner to a healthcare delivery organization, and it's not their compliance. Who here answered the question? 3 people. Just kidding. They said we would make it fun, you know, just kind of like a Super Mario Brothers. That's my age. Okay, there's more to come. Oh, well, look at this. He had the cheat code, apparently. Anyway, from the looks of it, most of you kind of have these up here. Oh, getting more people responding. This guy right here. Okay, we're going to go to the next slide, please. The PowerPoint slide. So our objectives today, in the brief amount of time that we have, are to cover the AAMI ANSI standard a little bit. There is an AAMI ANSI standard around AEM now, recently published. Implement and document a compliant AEM, right? We're going to talk about aspects to consider in the implementation and the continuous monitoring. Talk about the end-to-end, so to speak, or the life cycle of an AEM. And lastly, and I kind of hit up on this, but end-to-end, I'm going to offer to you all that CMS states that it should not affect the safety of the device intended by the OEM, right, or some language like that. I'm going to say that you also should be looking at improving the safety, reliability, and quality of your program. And I'll say this here, I'll pause for a second here before I go on to the next slide, and that is reliability and the efficiency or the quality of your program can play an important role in why you would want to do an AEM. You, if you're an in-house program or you're a third-party provider that is authorized to implement or manage an AEM program, you have a risk that you're taking, a greater risk. Why not take on a little bit of the reward, right? If you can manage your staff better and they can do better, higher level thinking things, your biomed techs certainly know how to do a lot more than turn a wrench. Use them for that if you wind up having some sort of efficiency gain by implementing an effective AEM. So the question is, why would you want to do an AEM? Sounds like most of you all are already doing an AEM, but I'd like to hear a little bit. You can read these up here, but I'd like to, and maybe I should record what those are for the go-to webinar, should I? Did I say what they are? Okay. So you can improve safety, efficiency, and the compliance of your program, your maintenance management program, whatever you call it, HTM. You can take a risk-based and evidence-informed, right, approach to optimizing maintenance. Again, risk-based and evidence-informed. That's a really good question. And here's the official response that I would give. AEM sometimes gets used by an organization to say, we can't hire as many environmental techs, right? Or imaging service engineers. It should not be used for that. Because remember, the safety cannot be lessened or cannot be reduced according to CMS. CMS is the construct for AEM, NEP cost. But you can gain efficiencies, right? And that efficiency may mean that you're replacing parts less frequently than the AEM, or the OEM recommends. And a good example of that would be you don't use the equipment as much as they thought you would use it. They did it in a, they made their maintenance procedure in a lab as opposed to the real world. And they thought this is a good practice, replace this so often. And occasionally I'll use this, and I'll use a car analogy in this case. Why would you replace your oil every 3,000 hours or 3,000 miles? It does, or at least that's what the manufacturers would have you think. And they've got some pretty good knowledge about that. Right? Cars are not the best example, but they're a good example of 3,000 miles has been the standard for many, many decades. And now it's 5,000. I had a vehicle in my last position that was 7,000. And the dealer even said, well, I wouldn't go 7,000, right? Bring it in at 5. They might have had better knowledge, or they might have been old school, still thinking it was at the 5. But the manufacturer is taking a stab at it when they release a new device, especially. If you look at some of the manufacturer manuals out there, some of them will even state this thing that's rather annoying to me. They'll say, because you have joint commission, and even worse, they'll say JACO, which is kind of annoying. Because you have joint commission, you have to test this, and nothing in the Joint Commission says it should be tested. But, well, there's a few exceptions. But regarding most all medical devices, nothing needs to be tested annually or service. So yes, it can improve your mileage. It can improve the wear or lessen the wear and tear on your vehicle. But you might decide that it's more appropriate to change your oil at 5,000 miles instead of what the manufacturer originally stated. It might be because you changed the oil type. That's something that you can do much more easily with cars than you can do with medical. Don't get me wrong. Certain supplies and everything else, you just don't want to get into changing those to a different grade of oil. Okay. I suggest make out some other things that you didn't know that you're not in the lab, right? You're not the engineer. But that's going back to the efficiency thing. If you have a surveyor come in, and we've seen this, they don't want to hear that you've been able to save staffing or labor costs. That's not a win to them, right? They're focused on what CMS has said, is you gotta be justifiable, defensible. You can't lessen the safety, and honestly, some of those surveyors are coming out going, well, if you don't have as many staff doing as many tasks, what does that mean? We'll talk about some options, but I have prizes. You get a good prize. Did you ask a tough question, and then I went on a long roll? Now, don't ask me necessarily how to operate it. I can give you the instructions, but it's much more complicated. And I didn't mention this, but to align with the conditions of participation with CMS and with other authorities having jurisdiction. So, know the standard. This is kind of the first boss in any game, or boss level. You need to have a risk-based evaluation. I've unfortunately seen an organization that didn't have a good risk-based evaluation, and then it raised questions, and then you don't want CMS, and you've got 30 days to explain all of your medical equipment management. It has to be risk-based, not just, it looks like it's low risk or high risk, but you really need to do an evaluation such that you weigh the risk. If it fails, because I did not do this EM as prescribed, the frequency and the activities of the manufacturer, you are assuming a certain amount of risk. That risk could be a liability to the patient or to your organization. You gunning for one of these coins? I wish I had like a sound effect. I thought about ding, ding, yeah. But really good point. And you're getting ahead, but involve your clinical stakeholders, your operational leaders, ask them. Then did you say that you invite them to suggest AEM? No. This is very, very valid, and we're going to talk about the use of medical equipment, right? Should be part of your AEM program. So absolutely. And what I took away from that is, yes, tell them no, right? But I'll add, and I'm sure this is the case with you, you validate, you verify, you do it in a diplomatic way, right? And I will add maybe something that maybe works, and that is your role in healthcare is to support the equipment maintenance strategies in the hospital and other strategies around medical equipment. A clinician's role is to serve at the bedside or to provide a lab result or whatever. And I say clinician, and I know there are some lab folks right now that will say, well, I'm not a clinician. But we all have these roles that we collaborate together. And that goes back to, hey, if I were to look, and I've been around a while, if I were to look at anybody's inventory, I could say, oh, that's typically used in this manner in this hospital, that medical device. But Kaiser and SoCal might say, hey, we use it in a slightly different way, and that might elevate the risk or not. And a good example of that in CMS's state operating manual, if you read just S&C 14-07, read the appendix. The state operating manual gives an example of this. Scaled in a pediatric environment may be a higher risk to a patient than in an adult environment. And if, probably you all know this, but if you're not aware of this, kids, they gain weight or lose weight, it's a higher percentage, right? If you're talking pounds or kilograms, it's a much higher percentage, and it can throw off medications, right? Prescriptions. It can throw off dietary needs. It can be a bad diagnostic tool versus, say, me going in and I'm going, oh, I could lose a little weight. I'm like, how much is that, right? I know I could lose a lot more, but anyway, that great question. So justify. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Yes, generally. Okay. We'll talk about a couple of exceptions later, but if you added filters, right, to your checks, that would be considered an AEM, right? The OEM says in this situation that you're bringing up, just check these things and replace the battery. And you now added the filter. Yes. And back in the day before AEM was the term, the Department of Veterans Affairs that I worked at, we call it manufacturer modified. And we still documented, here's the steps, so all of the technicians knew what should be done. But it still is an AEM because you're deviating from the activities that the manufacturer. Now, there's some nuance to this. If, say, at one organization that I love, I came into the organization and I said, why are we doing I needed to understand why we were doing anesthesia machines twice as frequently. It had been determined, not through necessarily a risk-based assessment or anything, but it was a gut feeling, right, before AEM, that doing the same step, no adjustment, same procedure, twice as frequently as the manufacturer would see an improvement. And they had already had enough evidence to prove that that actually improved the longevity of those particular ventilators and reduced the number of calls that your OR tech gets that you don't want to have, like the anesthesia machines not working quite right. They reduce those to almost zero. So you can change the frequency. More frequent, less frequent, AEM. And then there are some exclusions, which most of you, I'm sure you know, there are some exclusions to what you can put on AEM if you're deemed possible. But does that answer? Yeah, it is an AEM. Yes, but I will add to this. I wouldn't necessarily openly disclose your inventory. If you're a Joint Commission hospital or a D&D or whatever, it needs to distinguish what's high risk and low risk, and also what is on an AEM not. If by chance you didn't have it on them, you wouldn't go running to them and say, hey, I just thought about this. This is an AEM. And I also wouldn't, and I'm not saying you run to them, but I also wouldn't necessarily offer that up unless it's as an example. I don't know if you were lucky enough to attend the VA's early morning session on how to prepare for a Joint Commission session. But their book that they put together gives samples of how they've done an assessment for what's on AEM, so that when the surveyors come in, and they typically do, they ask for your medical equipment management plan and some other things. They also give them a couple of samples. So here's how we work it. So that might be a way I would recommend. And then we'll keep going, but good conversations. Track decisions and the performance of those decisions. So by that, hopefully you all get this, but hey, putting it on an AEM, like I pointed before, doesn't mean it just stays on it. You could have had an incident that could have been prevented by a different maintenance practice, being the OEM, if you're on an AEM. It could be that the OEM, this is not always thought about, but the OEM has changed their stance and now has a different maintenance procedure. Maybe you should evaluate that. Say, hey, maybe we'll go back to the OEM because it's smarter than what we have. Well, if you haven't seen this, there's at least one company, one large, I think they're the largest lab company out there by itself. They are using AI in developing their maintenance strategy. So, and it's can play a little bit here and there. But this is a good point. If I don't get to this in the later slides, I do have it in here, but make sure that your contractors are doing what you expect and getting approval from what your hospital, however your hospital approves whether or not they can use an AEM. If you're a completely outsourced hospital, I've heard some ISOs say, well, then we have the right to develop AEMs. Not necessarily. Typically, at least one group that would see this and say, yes, that's fine, but mostly do this, is the environmental care committee, right? That would still need to be run through some hospital, because it's the hospital that loses their accreditation. Not the third party. And that goes for your contractors, right? Your multi-year contractors and those ones that do occasional work for you. And then say infusion pumps occasionally for repair. If they come back with a PM and say PM passed, Is it the only MPM, right? And is that what you have, an expectation? What is not AEM? Remove the PMs. We already talked about that. Remove all PMs or remove all PMs of certain categories and call it an AEM, right? The OEM doesn't matter. The OEM absolutely matters. If you can obtain the information from the manufacturer about what their thoughts are, that should be your baseline for understanding what your thoughts are in addition to that. And we'll figure it out later, right? We'll put it on AEM and then we'll do the write-up. I've seen, yes. I can think of a couple of examples that I've run across that same phrasing. I don't know if you heard it, but what if they say, hey, follow your own local jurisdiction? Or better yet, I've seen the ones too that say, follow your hospital policy. Well, if your hospital policy says follow the manufacturer, and the manufacturer says follow your hospital policy, you're in the loop, right? That's where you're not on an AEM necessarily if you don't do anything, right? Because they've said, and I'm saying barring any other authorities having jurisdiction, your state radiology department doesn't say, hey, you got to do this annually for our state. Barring any of that, you're not on really an AEM, but the frustration is the manufacturer, right, wrote this silly statement. That's where you got to put on that engineering hat, that HTM engineer hat, and say, can we do anything that's maintenance worthy, right? Should we do anything that's maintenance worthy? And I say maintenance in the broader scope of can it be checked, right? Not that it necessarily needs a part replacement, but can you identify a failure before it happens or the wearing in some way? Or can you maintain something in the sense of, I'm going to update the package, right? But the one that keeps coming to mind is there's a laryngoscope brand. And they say that. And it's like, why are you saying? The other term I'll throw out there, thanks for bringing that up, is when they say periodically or frequently. You know, I addressed that at one organization. I went to, we had a subcommittee, medical equipment management committee, that here's what I suggest. Had a little draft policy and said, it's called periodically, what do we say? Periodically is annually to start with until we have better knowledge. And that's what the policy said, and frequently is 6 months. And I said, part of the problem is because my techs keep coming to me and asking me, hey, look, we'll just define it, right, for now, and then we would use evidence later on to say, oh, you know what, frequently really meant quarterly in this case, but at least we took a good stab. So it's generic terms. Yeah, I should ask you where you're from. Yeah, sorry. California is rather unique. Not the only place. I mentioned some imaging radiation or radiation safety bodies in different states have some testing requirements in addition to what the manufacturer would say. But California also has Title 22. And I know it says that a biomed technician is certified, right? That's why it's removed from the 2012 and future, well, even before 2012, it was removed. But 2012 is, well, if I can get through a few more slides, I'll flash up here, but if I don't show this slide, reach out to Amy, join a standards committee. Suggest, I think that's one place where you can kind of group together about something like that. Now, CMS really should override the state when it comes to hospitals that are accredited, because they do in most other states. They said, I don't care to the state fire marshals, like they did in Nebraska. They said, you'll follow NFPA 99, 2012 for inspections, and these annual inspections are no longer necessary. That I came into that about 7 years ago in Nebraska, where right on the edge. kind of the same thing as Title 22, not as OS. Okay, so there's a slide that will be a polling question. So I'm gonna ask you a couple of questions here, and I'm gonna ask you, is it AEM compliant or not, right? And I didn't talk about the exclusions, and I'm probably gonna give away a little bit of this, but there are some exclusions that are not AEM eligible, again, for deemed hospitals. Your ambulatory surgical center, you're fine. If you're a critical access hospital that gets Medicare and Medicaid dollars, there is a different S&C. It'll be mentioned later on the slide, but it's the same as 14-07 for most hospitals. But keep that in mind, AEM could be applied anywhere else except for hospitals that are accredited through some deemed accreditation through CMS. But that's the majority, right? So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and we're going to choose whether or not the scenario is AEM compliant or not. Okay, first question, and I think we can flip to the slides, is or the Menti slide. Your hospital has tracked, what was it, 3 years of high reliability. I think we did the example of infusion pumps, but I got to look at the slide on this, change these, tweak them a little bit, try and trip you up. High reliability on something like 3 years. Your team has determined that, well, what's that? Oh, this is awesome. I didn't know it did this. Okay, well, I must mess with the slides. I told you it'd be fun. Who's laughing the most at this one? Anyway, let's just go with your scenario. By a raising of the hands, how many think that this is AEM compliant? It's very basic, but is this AEM compliant, something that you could put on an AEM? Okay, if I only have like 1 or 2 people that say it is, and they're right, yeah. Yes, yeah, documented it, shortened for slide. Documented evidence in service reporting. No critical failures. OEM recommends PM annually, but they're saying, hey, let's go biannually 2 years. AEM compliant? Well, I want to see. Okay, we hear a lot of yeses. Any no? Don't feel no. Okay, is that a no or a? And there's a maybe. Any maybe? Like I don't know. Yeah. Good consideration. Right. So if we can, you know what? Because those slides aren't working, I'm just going to go back to the PowerPoint. Because I think on these, I have all the, don't go to that one. Just go to the PowerPoint, please. So yes, this would be AEM compliant, but it's a good point that you brought up, the frequency, right? They're frequently used, but you assuming that same 3 years, the first 3 years, you had about the same frequency of use. Adjusting to a biannual frequency, doing the same procedures might be a good move, right? It might, it's not eliminating, but you're eliminating at least 1 every other year in the PM sense, but you're optimizing your resources, and you know that, as my mantra goes, if it's maintenance worthy, do it, right? But if it's not, spend your time on the things that are maintenance worthy. So this might allow you to maybe do more frequent PMs on something that could be improved by more frequent PMs. Or you could add materials or extra labor or whatever to something like a filter replacement, where a manufacturer might say, just check the filter, and you're like, you know what, we're just going to go ahead and replace the filter, take my guys and gals 10 more minutes, but it's the right thing to do. Still need to do a risk assessment. But that risk assessment is probably pretty easy. Right thing to do. Instead of check, we're just going to replace. Now, I have Suli here who's probably taking notes, and I'm going to hear some of these things from Vincent. Suli, this is just a very, very high level. Okay? I know he's heard AEM discussions much more than I. Next scenario is your CT. Now, you have a CT scanner that fails often enough that you're thinking, well, maybe we should do PMs more frequently, right? You want to increase the availability. You want to make sure patients are treated or diagnosed, I should say, by the CT. Is this AEM compliant or not? Yes? Oh, sorry, go ahead. Ask any questions. Oh, you're not supposed to give away. Oh, anyway. Look, he's going to get another point. Oh, I'm going to take it. Okay. So here's the problem with imaging devices, specifically ionized radiation devices. CTs, this would not be considered AEM compliant to put it on a more frequent basis. CMS states that you must follow the same frequency and the same activities for your CT. But I want to, yeah, go ahead. Maybe, yes, same for lasers as well. Why that decision was made is not a discussion necessarily that we should get into here, but I do want to illustrate that there are some exceptions. Remember that CMS is not the only authority. CMS states you will do these following. However, the American College of Radiology, for example, ACR, might stipulate that you test your CTs more frequently for some sort of quality check or whatever. So that's an out. You may not want to call it a PM. Okay. So the surveyor coming in, you don't probably want to have a lot of debate. You may want to call this a quality check or physicist check, and that gets to the physicist. Your physicist, whoever you contract to or whoever resides in your organization, may determine that to improve the outcomes for your patients, certain checks need to be done more frequently. Again, not necessarily maintenance as you called it or service, but it may be checked. And under the physicist scope in some states, the physicist may appoint an imaging service engineer to collect the results of, say, values as far as dose, et cetera, luminance. So the CT example, it's not AEM compliant necessarily. You could do some other checks more frequently in this situation where it fails all the time. Call it what it is, but I would not recommend you call it a PM. Does that make sense? Yes. If you're using your system, like the, if you're using your CMMS, I have done this myself, is I have a code for OEM PMs, AEM PMs, right? OEM more frequently, and then I have a QA one for what could be considered a proactive or a planned activity. There are other ways to flag this in different systems or whatever, but the QA can be in systems that I've used. You can schedule the QA if you make it look like a PM, but you call it a QA. Now, on your medical equipment management plan or your policy or plan for your AEM, I think that's the best place to put that. Say, this is not an AEM. This is a quality assurance check, right? If that's what you determine is the route or the most appropriate umbrella term. I wouldn't get too granular. Like you could come up with a lot of different things, but if you have something like that, quality assurance is the one I use. It can be used, and I've gone through several joint commissions with that same result. I work now with several different clients across the country. One large healthcare system gets joint commission almost every week, naturally, not because they're under some sort of scrutiny. And joint commission is not asked them any probing questions. That doesn't mean that another surveyor wouldn't come in and do it, but they haven't asked them any probing questions about what they do, and they do that same thing. Their physicist has determined, their physicist group, large enough healthcare system, has determined on imaging, we need these checks more frequently, but it's none of them that we've seen, at least from ECRI standpoint, with that system are PM, not turning a wrench, not opening up something. It's verifying the quality of the image. Does that make sense? So yeah, I would put it myself. Any other thoughts where you would put it? I'd put it in your MEMP or in your AEM. I should have done this, and I apologize for this. Put it in the S&C 1407 and the attached state operating manual from CMS. It states that imaging equipment, imaging slash radiologic, has to have the same frequency and procedures or tasks, whatever the language is, as the original manufacturer equipment. They do go on in that same paragraph to talk about how you can do other devices, right? So I interpret that, and it's been interpreted in this AAMI standard. It's interpreted that if you're compliant with CMS, you can't deviate one way or another. You can't do it even more frequently. And that, by the way, is more upsetting to me than if you couldn't do it less frequently. I used to be an imaging engineer, and I can say that there would have been a lot of things that I could have tweaked or adjusted and fine-tuned, and then I wouldn't get a service call. But GE or Philips or whatever, it doesn't. Yeah, from me. That's interesting. So you work the way around. I was going to say, remember what I said is generally, you're compliant. You're compliant. You met it with a different way than most of us probably have done. At least I haven't done that. Is gone back and said, you'll rewrite. I would have probably said, you got to rewrite this, but be proactive on your contracts moving forward when you consider this. Make sure that you have language in there that says you will not follow, even with the OEMs, because you'll get some pushback. I have gotten some pushback from OEMs that'll say, well, we're the OEM. Like, I have certain conditions that I need to have, right? Because my compliance is more probably than any OEM. Now, I say that, I say probably, maybe I'm wrong at this, but if you look at the list of agencies, and we've talked about CBET, which by the way is also the Colorado. When you said that, I was like, oh, that's in Colorado. But CDPH, there's a radiation safety or ionizing safety group here, I'm sure under DHS or something in the state of California. The FDA regulates some of our service when it comes to imaging equipment or what we replace. There's CMS. CMS has their AOs, like the Joint Commission, and the list goes on and on. NFPA 99, yeah, it's great for the code and stuff, but who really has to follow it more than the manufacturers? It still winds up being us unless they want the UL from the manufacturers. So there's all these layers, and then I have heard too many times from a manufacturer, well, we've got to comply with the FDA. Like, let me give you my list, right? Now, I haven't gone with that list with most of them, but I've said to some, you're a contractor, right? To my healthcare organization, and usually, as I mentioned, I've worked directly for these healthcare systems, sometimes as a third party, and even in that case, have a responsibility for that customer, whoever it is, internal estimate. So keep that one in mind, and I'm glad you brought it up, because if you're not paying attention, that there are manufacturers out there that will say this. and say, well, we're the manufacturer. You haven't already had that conversation. If you're not in contracting yet, you'll see it. But tell them, look, we need you to deliver your service, of course, in this timely manner. In this, we need this detailed, but we also need to follow what we expect. And part of the reason for the we expect, not just the compliant, is if you know what your contractors are doing, it's the same thing as if you know what your technicians are doing. Relatively, you know that they have followed the same procedure, and you can analyze that data and then determine whether or not you are doing the right thing for your, you still might stick with the same contractor, like you mentioned, Olympus, years to come. But you might say to Olympus, hey, look, in our environment, we don't feel like we need it, right? And they'll work a deal with you, especially if you do more frequency. And I'm not saying just Olympus, but sure, you want to do more PMs, you now have justified an AEM with your contractor. Cost. So I'm going to move on. Scenario 3, and again, no failures. Well, I want to move it to an AEM program, and I believe I just messed up here, and I said biennial checks. I meant to say semi-annual, and we've already kind of covered those. You can do, more frequent. I'll update these slides. So, well, if you do something every 6 months, there are approaches, but if you do the same thing every 6 months, it's just more frequent. The same thing as you would have done. But if you did say split the checks, you said I'm going to do half of them this year, or half of them this 6 months, and then at the top of the year. Well, clinical engineering or HPM would track that, and it is. It really depends on your CMMS. I used to call myself a bit of a CMMS nerd. I used to try and get the demos and stuff like this. So I'm a little out of touch on what all the CMMSs do right now. But you usually can play around with these enough to put multiple schedules on a device if you want to do that. And one example that I've seen do that is years ago on CT, there were 2 different options, if you will, for PMs on, I think it's the light speed, oil. And you could do a monthly check, and it was all the monthly checks added up to the semi-annual and annual checks, or you could just do a much longer semi-annual. We went to, at that organization, we went to doing the monthly checks so that we minimize the downtime to the CC. It's hard to enumerate all the authorities having jurisdiction that you have in your medical equipment. But you should capture that somewhere. And the reason it's hard is because sometimes those things change mid-year. And your typical MEMT is reviewed only annually by whatever committee, the environmental care. So what I would suggest is that it be a policy that you manage, or even a check, like a form that says, okay, these are the authorities that we have to be concerned with, right? And it's documented so that you're not forgetting them, because they're CMS, for example. And if you have a lab, the lab may have CLES applicable to all the labs or some of the labs, and that's really under CMS, but it's kind of different. And if you have dialysis, it's a different division, so to speak, of CMS. So you might want to have this list of who our agencies are, and this is really good practice. Again, I picked this up a long time ago. I worked in the ISO world, is understand what your hospital is, or your hospital system has. It becomes more complex when you're in a multi-vendor environment like I was, where we're saying, okay, the state of Nebraska has this, and the state of Tennessee has this. But make the list of who we need to be concerned about. If you don't know, say, where to start, which is very common, and you've been around a while. But if you don't know where to start, or you're like, hey, I want some feedback, ask people in this room. Reach out. We don't have necessarily a great, like, neutral, vendor neutral community like we used to have with Biomed Talk or something like that. Well, take it in steps. Depends on where you are in this journey. If you already have been documenting these things, some organizations will document tasks that pass the whole team procedure, and then they'll do exceptions and they'll know those exceptions. Right. That's one area, or corrective maintenance. If you can identify from your CMMS that you had to replace or repair a power cord on X number of devices, you have data. If you don't have that data yet, take it back to what data is important for you to collect. Now, there's several different maintenance approaches here, and out of respect to the icon. Evidence-based maintenance is based on what you're seeing, right? The cumulative amount of data that you've collected, maybe even with other partner organizations. So you could use their data, right? You could say, oh, very uncommon that we use. Power cord example is a little more nuanced. You could have mobile devices in your environment and fixed, like patient monitors in a lab. But if you're not collecting the data you want to collect, or even if you're collecting data, question what data you're collecting. And then communicate to your staff, train why you're collecting these, why they're important. Now you may have to validate, you should probably validate every once in a while to validate what's being collected, so that you can look at the results and analyze them. But to give you a good example from my history, I saw no value in collecting the results, the actual numbers from electrical safety tests. I came into an organization that was like half the shop was like, oh, you got to collect this stuff, and half the shop said, what? And we all thought through it, but I already got it. I said, nobody, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe some of you in this room, said nobody looks for trends on electrical safety testing and does something, right? What you need to know is the value. Oh, okay, maybe. Is it by the numbers, if they trend up or down? Oh, okay. Oh, yes. Sorry, that's a good example. Thanks for bringing it. You know, I work on that. I'll just say. So there are some nuances, and that one is a measured value though. On certain systems, they say measure this for Fresenius, right? It's back in the 2080s or whatever. It says measure this, and if this is going south, right? If it's over a certain amount, then just replace it. And they're almost entirely right on it. They don't even debate it. But on the general electrical safety, it's not a matter of watching a trend over the next 6 months or a year. measure what you think you're going to do something with before you tackle the whole world. I have seen some of us at an AAMI conference or whatever present, like, I have my technicians fill out this huge lengthy form. And I've looked at it and I've gone, well, how much compliance are you going to do with that? Right? But some of the better presentations I've seen that might have a medium size form, right, on the CMS or whatever, say, we also train our staff to understand the importance of why these elements need to be captured. Personally, and I don't know where all of you came from in the industry, but as I started my role as a biomedical equipment technician one, I always was kind of inquisitive anyway, but I asked the question like, who's the Joint Commission, right? Why do they matter? And that was a pretty simple answer. But later, I asked other questions like, what are we doing with electrical safety results? So it might be good to do. Now we're over time, and there's this great panel discussion going on. These presentations are not going on yet, but it'll be going on shortly. I think it's good for everybody. I will say this about right to repair. It's a collaborative process, right? Hopefully the panelists will talk about this favorably from the manufacturer's standpoint. But I will say it's also essential for us to be able to do our job and understand it. And I'll leave you on this one note. I've had one vendor tell me they're not going to tell me what they do, but they want it under contract. They're the only game in town. They won't train anyone. And I said, I don't see any, I don't know what value I'm getting from the contract other than you're maintaining it. It's my compliance, and we're not going to buy your product. It wasn't in this case, but that vendor came around very quickly. Now, don't do what I did in this case. I had no authority to say we're not going to buy your product. It was just that final negotiation about they wanted to sell a point of sale service contract on getting it. I didn't have that authority, but I quickly did, because the next call I got right after we politely, and it wasn't abruptly, concluded that call, was from the directors that were getting this very big spend, and they had a lot of money and they're excited to get it, and said, you know what, you explained that very well on the call for us to understand and be fully supported. I thought I was like, hey, what the heck are you doing? But make sure that you have an understanding of what people are doing to your equipment in your healthcare system for value, but also for safety. Don't get the response of like, we're not. Please come up, get some coins. Or if you want something. Well, so that's a really good point. And the example that I typically think of on the extreme end is air ambulance or ambulance services. Same equipment, same exact equipment, same infusion pump, same monitor, right? Transport monitor is in your hospital environmental controls, and it probably isn't subject nearly enough or nearly as much to the one that goes on the life flight or whatever. And on the other end, your clinic probably not using some of their equipment as much as. That's my opinion. Does anybody want one of these? We should wrap up so you all can attend that. Thank you. Thank you. You got one? You didn't get one, did you? Oh man. Okay, this side's getting all of these unless you guys want. I have an 8-year-old that tested one of these already. He's got one. Like, oh, these little keychain video games. He says they're hard to play, hard to figure out. So, well, yeah. It's got like, I think it's got Tetris and something else in it. Thank you. And if anybody wants some of these chocolate coins, I'm not interested in taking them back on the flight. Okay, do you want those for your shop? You're like, hey, yeah. You want those coins for your shop?
I'm good.
Okay.
Oh, sure. Thank you for the presentation. We're one of the making members, so I actually worked with Carlos, who was helpful, kind of showing me like a lot of what you guys offer. Actually,
Oh, yeah.
all Carlos, you know?
Yeah.
And so I like tried to pull it hard, but it was great.
We do offer,
presentation.
like I didn't want to talk, and then this wasn't really an ECRI link. Or
Oh no,
yeah,
no, I know,
but
yeah. No, I know, but I'm just saying it's just great because a lot of the the biomedical data has some stuff on the EM, which is great. You kind of got me the right and then basically we're essentially writing it for our our campus. Even though we don't collaborate all these and stuff, but yeah, this has been good information.
I'm surprised you guys don't necessarily, and
It's so do I.
I mean,
started off as a
UCI's all kind of been different for a long time,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
With Ted and then
Yeah.
whoever succeeded.
Who was it? Yeah, the Charles Adams was there. He actually came out of us, and I was at USC camp. But no, this is we're getting closer to pushing the button to get this all going. But I don't know if it was there who else brought up the California too. That's the one. That's the our one. California.
Yeah, and I should have, and I thought about it when I was putting together the presentation, and I put it aside, and I thought about it some more, and I never.
But I was just talking to somebody
For this?
last night, and it's helpful to feel like, oh, that's right. Like a California thing, not a. I don't want. Oh, I think still
Oh, is that where that